Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Distinguished Professors Lecture Series. Just introduce myself. I'm Jielu, Associate Dean in Research Excellence in Faculty of Engineering and IT. We started this distinguished lecture series from 1917, about 6 years ago. And so far, we have 12 lectures organized. So today is the number 12 organized. So all the speakers are distinguished professors in the faculty. So they come from computer science, artificial intelligence, civil, telecommunication, and electronic, and biosystems. So covers all the areas of computer science and engineering. Today is our pleasure to have a distinguished professor, Tuan Nguyen, from our faculty to give a distinguished lecture. Maybe you know him already. I just quickly introduce him to all of you. Professor Tuan is a leading global expert in bioresearch. He's currently is a distinguished professor and in the School of Biomedical Engineering and the Center of Health Technologies. And he's a leadership fellow of the National Health and Medical Research Council. He has published over 200 journal papers in very top journals in his area. And he has received very high citations, more than 38,000 citations. His work has been recognized with multiple awards, prizes, and fellowships. Just give you 2 examples. He has been elected as a fellow of the Australia Academy of Health and Medical Science. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales. And more important, last year, he was being awarded a very high honor award, an Order of Australia for his contributions in medical research and higher education in the area. So please join me to welcome Tuan AM to his dinner.
Well, thank you very much, GS, for your kind introductions. I feel fabulous about myself. However, this presentation is not about myself, but it's about you. It's all about knowing the numbers of fracture risk. It's all about managing your risk, and more importantly, about protecting your bones, which hopefully will lead into the healthy aging. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I just simply center my presentation around that through line. I know that a lot of you in the audience are now asking the question of why. Why should you concern about bone fractures? If I have a fracture, I can go to the orthopedic surgeon and then they will fix my bone, and then here we go again. However, the thing is not that simple, and I'm going to explain to you why should you worry about that. Number one, it is the high prevalence of the fracture that you should be concerned about. I'm sure that most of you are aware that the 1 in 10 of women will have a breast cancer during their remaining lifetime. So we talk about 10%, but you're probably not
aware that 17% of women from the age of 50 will have a hip fracture during their remaining lifetime. So you can think that hip fractures is even more prevalent than breast cancer, but not a lot of people know that. Now, the problem with hip fracture is that approximately 8% of men also have hip fractures. But of course, it's, you have to put the number in context in terms of things like a stroke. The stroke in women is about 20%, and stroke in men is about 14%. Now, if you add up all of those hip fracture and vertebral fracture, you will find that the magnitude in terms of the number and the prevalence of fracture is even higher than stroke and other common disease. And that is not something that I try to scare you, but that is the reality that the Prime Minister report for healthy aging, they mentioned that bone health should be the priority in the future healthy aging. The problem is not the fracture that you should be concerned about, but it's on about mortality. Several years ago, George Bernard Shaw, he had a hip fracture. Apparently, it was very painful for him. So he said that if I survive this, I will be immortal. Unfortunately, he didn't survive that. He died after that. And he was only one of many statistics in the world which indicate that up to 1 out of 5 patients with a hip fracture will die after 12 months. If you have breast cancer, if you unfortunately have breast cancer, your survival probability is much higher than this. But you don't realize that 1 out of 5 men and women have a hip fracture will die after 12 months. So you can imagine that by the end of this talk, there will be 2,000 people around the world die of a hip fracture. So I'll tell you how serious it is. And mortality and hip fractures affect all kinds of people, not just common people like us. All of these celebrities, the Queen's Elizabeth II, the Queen's mother, President Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II. They all have a common things. They have the hip fracture and they die after hip fractures. So you can see that hip fractures really affect a large proportion of people around the world, particularly during their aging. So now the next question is again why people have fractures. So I need to summarize my 30-year research into a number of slides so that you can understand the key issue and how we're going to prevent fracture, not for me but for yourself. Now, the key reason for why people have fracture is that because their bones become weakened. So the bone strength is reduced. And bone strength is normally measured in terms of bone mass and bone density. And I have bad news for you. The bone health doesn't look good. We are a product of an evolutionary history. So, we and chimps, share a common ancestor, many million years ago. But do you realize that the chimpanzee, they do not have fracture at their vertebra. They do not have a vertebral fracture, never. Only we, human, will have a fracture as a vertebral. And fracture vertebral also a major issue. So why is that the case? I think, that is the price that we have to pay for being able to walk upright or to walk on 2 legs. We have to pay the price for that, And we also have to pay the price for the agricultural revolutions about 68 million years ago. Since the agricultural revolution, we become less physically active, and that, as a result, introduced to the problem of bone imbalance between bone resorption and bone formation, if you look at it from a molecular level, which ultimately result in the weakened bone. And that's why, we have fracture. Now, that is an approximate reason, but there's also a very close reason. A lot of people, when I say a lot, I mean up to 20% of people these days in Western societies are smokers. And smokers have twofold increase in the risk of fracture, including hip fractures. Imagine that, if the whole world, if everybody, stop smoking, then we can prevent actually 25% of hip fracture around the world. So smoking is one of the major risk factors for fractures. But apart from smoking, excessive alcohol intakes and all of those unhealthy, nutrition, they all contribute to the weakened bone. And that is also the close reason why we have fracture. Now, many of you probably have heard of the words from Neil Armstrong in the 1960s. One small step, one giant leap. Yes, it was the case. But didn't you realize that, most of the astronauts, when they land, they could not walk. We love them, that's why we have to carry them around. Actually, if they walk, then they will break their bone. So imagine that, within 2 weeks, in the non-gravity environment, these people will lose up to 10% of their bone mass. So it tells you how important physical activities is in terms of fracture prevention. So apart from lifestyle factors, poor nutrition, physical activity is a major, or lack of physical activity is a major risk factor for fractures. But all of these lifestyle factors explain less than 20% of the variance of fracture liability between people. It couldn't explain all of them. So what are the rest? Well, I show you in this cartoon, there's a very interesting, patient there. He looked a little bit abnormal. And the doctor said, well, I think there's something to do with your genome, with your genes. And that is where, the forefront of medical research these days. In this, genetics or genetic variation between people explain a large proportion of people why, people have fracture. How do we know? How do we know that fractures or bone mass or bone strength is due to genetic factors? We have to use the reasoning from, you can see from the man there, his name is Francis Galton. He's very famous, to me, he's one of the greatest, scientists in the world. We have to use his reason in the 19th century. And Francis Galton was a pioneer in twin research. To me, it's a genetic research. And his reasoning was very simple. If you look at the monozygotic twins, they share 100% of their genotype. And if you compare that with the dizygotic twins, they share 50% of their genotypes. So Galton reasoning that if a trait like a height, weight, eye colors, or bone density is due to genetic factors, then the correlation, the within correlation in a monozygotic twins must be higher than dizygotic twins. Absolutely simple reasoning, very powerful, very convincing too, right? And that is exactly, what we observe in practice. Many years ago, back in the 1987, a friend of mine, Professor Nicholas Pocock from St. Vincent Hospital and the Garvan Institute of Medical Research, he just did that. So what he did was he recruited a number of twins, monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins, and then he measured their bone density, and then he plotted, the correlation between twin 1 and twin 2. So on the top panel is the correlation in bone density among monozygotic twin. I just remind you again, these people, they share 100% of their genotype. Now, if you love statistics, the correlation coefficient was 0.92. What about dizygotic twins? Well, you can see, the spread, of the point around the curve, and the correlation coefficient was about 0.36. This difference in terms of correlation coefficient in bone strength is a clear indication that bone density, or in this case bone mass, is genetically regulated. So that is the most convincing evidence, and our group was probably among the first in the world that have demonstrated the genetics role in fracture liability. Now, this is a major achievement in the 1980s, but the question is how do we know which genes, which specific genes are associated with bone fracture and bone density? Now there are 23,000 genes in our body and million of genetic variants. How do we know which genetic variants are associated with bone density? Well, one way to do that is that you analyze every single signal from the genome and then you will find which one is correlated with bone density. However, in the early 1990s, that was a very expensive exercise, so we couldn't do that. So instead of doing that, we did what we call the genome-wide association study. So out of 100 million SNPs, we just take the random sample from each of the chromosome, and then we analyze the relation of those SNPs with the bone density. And that's how, we discover more than 200 genetic variants associated with osteoporosis and fracture. Now, with these 200 genetic variants, it's a wonderful discovery. It is a triumph of the new technologies, not just our statistical technology, but also the biotech technology. Because it's the first time allow you to analyze hundreds of thousands of these genetic variants at once. So it's a wonderful thing, and it's create a lot of papers, and including me. I think I also have a lot of papers, like this one, and it thickened my CV a little bit. But am I proud of it? I'm not sure. The reason is that the problem rather is that most of these genes, most of these genetic variants have a very modest, effect on bone fracture, with the relative risk, being from say 1.05 to 1.1. In clinical setting, that is not an actionable association. Something increase the risk of outcome or disease by twofold. We call it that actionable outcome. An association with a relative risk of 1.05 or 1.10, yeah, it's good for your thesis, but it's not good for clinical action at all. And that is exactly what we found. All of these genes, more than 200 genes, the magnitude of association, each of these genes and fractures are very modest, meaning that they are not useful at all. Well, they're useful for publication, but they are not useful, for the patient. So what are we going to do about that? Well, initially I thought, maybe, we have to find some way, to get around these issues. And a lot of people say, well, why don't we just simply add up the number of alleles, the number of risk alleles, and then we got a single number. But hang on, the number of risk alleles may be a simple combination. What about the weight of association between each of these alleles and fracture risk? So we have to create what we call it osteogenomic profile, and that was my solution to the field. Osteogenomic profile is really a genetic signatures that represent the weighted sum of all the risk alleles from multiple genetic variants. And at the time I call it osteogenomic profile because I didn't invent other words. But subsequently, my colleagues in the field, in the genetic field, they have a new word for it. They call it polygenic risk score, PRS. So each of us maybe have 200 genetic variants that are associated with bone loss or with bone mass or with fractures. And we can combine this information into one number. And that number is unique among us. And I think, when I work on this one, I realized that all of us are different. You may have the same color with me, you may have the same weight, the same age, maybe the same cultural background with me, but you and me, have a different genetic makeup. And that genetic makeup, that uniqueness is defined by, the genetic profile. So the genetic profile Autogenomic profile or the PRS here is a unique for each individual, and I think that is where we come close to the ideal of precision medicine. Precision medicine is defined as the right treatment for the right people at the right time. That is the definition. All of us are different. I'm different from you. You're different from others. So each of us should have a unique risk profile, a unique risk estimate, not the same as other people. And that's where we can see the distribution of the polygenic risk score in the individual population. If you see the red one, the one with the red one, it indicates the risk or the probability of fractures if those are people who have a higher PRS, polygenic risk score. However, if you look at the distribution in the general population, it's a very much a normal distribution, which the majority of people right in the middle, the one with the green color, meaning that they are at low risk, with a very few people in the red color, that's when they are at the high risk. However, there are few people, less than 10%, in that high risk category. However, with this, the PRS or autogenomic risk profile, we was able to incorporate it into what I call a patient equation. Several months ago, I read a wonderful book. It's called The Patient Equation. The patient equation book argued that each of us have a unique equation. And that equation is defined by the cultural background that we come from, defined by the clinical risk factor that we possess, and the genetic makeup. So each of us have a patient, an equation. And I like the idea very much. And from there, I said, well, it reminds me of the saying from Jeffrey Rose, one of my heroes in preventive medicine. Jeffrey Rose was a cardiologist, and he was a very influential epidemiologist in terms of public health prevention. I will come back, with his idea. So several years ago, back in 1990s, Jeffrey Rose said that risk assessment must consider all relevant factors together rather than confined to a single test, because for nearly all diseases are multifactorial. And that's exactly what happened to osteoporosis and fracture. Because the risk of fracture or the risk of the disease is not simply conferred by the clinical risk factor or lifestyle factor or environment factor like that, but also conferred by genetic factors that I mentioned to you earlier. So from my point of view, it's not a patient equation, but your equation. It's about your equation. It's unique. Your equation, your risk is equal to your genes plus or minus the clinical risk factor, or you can consider them in the environmental factor overall. The problem with that equation is how can we estimate the parameters? Because equation, you have to have parameters, right? So how do you estimate the parameters? Well, it's very different from mathematics or some other natural science where they have to do simulation to get the parameter. We in the clinical side, we do differently. In order to estimate the parameter, we have to run a study. And this is the study that we initiated back in 1989. At the time, we recruit approximately 4,000 men and women 60 years and older. And then we follow them. We follow them every 2 years. We ask them to come back. We follow them for 30 years. Can you believe that? To measure for 30 years. Obviously, some of them, they die along the way, so we have to replace them with a new cohort, and I'll go back to that one. And with that study, we was able to collect all the data pertaining to fracture risk and mortality and so on and so forth. And based on that data, we can create the equation for each individual. And that equation was called the Garvan Fracture Risk Calculator, because at the time I was associated with the Garvan Institute of Medical Research. And when we implemented that research, then we introduced into our bone health, healthy aging group. And so this photo remind me of the launch of the Garvan fracture risk calculator to the world. And I'm sure you know that John Hewson, any of you remember John Hewson? John Hewson was a professor of economics, or David, from economics, professor of economics, so one of the youngest professor of economics from the University of New South Wales. And he became the chairman of the Healthy Bone Australia, so he came there. So I got a photo with him. I thought, wow, that's very nice. But he was not a prime minister. he lost the election there. Anyway, so we launched our bones fracture risk calculator at the time, and it was a very successful. But then we thought that, well, after 10 years, we have to do something new, and our solution is a bone check. So when I come to UTS, we did a little bit more work in terms of skeletal age and more genetic work, and we come up with what we call a bone check algorithm. Bone check is a collection of algorithms that allow us to predict the risk of fracture within 5 years, and more importantly, to put the risk within the context, and then how to prevent fracture for people in the 60s or older. To give you some idea, bone check took the input variable, including age, sex, and lifestyle factors, and genetic variants, and so on. And the output was in the right of the screen, which essentially tell an individual the risk of the fracture within the next 5 years. A lot of other people, they consider 10-year risk, but to me, I think 5-year risk is better, because I had my own example. 5-year risk is, for people who are 60s and older, 5-year risk is easier to manage, right? 10-year risk, well, we'll probably die by then, so probably difficult to manage. So that's why my philosophy, we introduced a 5-year risk, not 10-year risk. And that's how we produce the bone check algorithm. And we have launched this bone check in mid-May this year. And until now, we have more than 10,000 users worldwide from 65 different countries. They use our bone check. So we are very happy. And I think, we project UTS name, worldwide, for instance. Now, but the problem with the bone check or other things is that the risk communication. Now, if I'm telling you that your risk of fracture in the next 10 years or 5 years is 10%, then the problem is that people don't hear the word 10%. They say, well, that means I have a 90% chance of no hip fracture, and because with that perception, they don't like to take any treatment. I mean, 10% risk of hip fracture is a very deadly serious. They should have go to treatment. But a lot of people, they don't get any treatment, because they see that 90% of the time that they will not have fracture. And that's the problem that contribute to the under-treatment that we have these days. So how do we get around that one? Well, we come up with a different idea. We said that instead of telling people about the probability of fracture, probability is a very funny concept. Not many people can grasp the concept. 10%, what does it mean? I mean, out of 100 people, 10 people will have fracture. Yeah, I know that. Oh, what about what about the Bayesian probability? That means the measure of belief that I will have a fracture with a 10%. So I think probability is really an issue. When we convey to the general public. So we come up with a different idea. We said, well, what about skeletal age? Now, I just wanted to remind you that people with a fracture, they have reduced life expectancy, right? And if we have a measure that both convey the risk of fractures and the consequence of fracture, in this case, the consequence of fracture is mortality. So skeletal age is a new metric that we just invented. We designed it so that it captures the risk of fracture and the consequence of fracture, the mortality consequence of fracture. So that is the whole idea behind skeletal age. So we define, operationally, we define skeletal age as a chronological age plus the years of life lost due to a fracture or due to the increased risk of fracture. So for that particular lady, she was at 65 years old, but because she had osteoporosis and because she already have a risk of a fracture, so we estimated that her skeletal age is 69 years. In other words, her risk of fracture is now not at 65 years anymore, but equivalent to a 65 years old. Her bone is aging very fast. Another interpretation is that she's 65 years, but her skeletal age is 69, meaning that she already lost 4 years of life. And I believe that, if we convey, this kind of metrics, we will be able to convey the gravity, the importance, the significance of fracture to people, rather than probability, which people probably don't understand or they do not appreciate it. Well, then the next question here, you may ask, does it work? Does it, the implementation of this risk communication and risk estimates, does it work? Well, we thought, it works. Now, I want to go back, to the double study again. In the 1990s, when we started the double study, we had about 1,300 women. This one is women data. And because a lot of people die after that, because they have to be 60 years or older in order to get into the study. So 10 years later, we started another study. We continued with a double study. It was a brand new cohort. So we got roughly about 1,000 people after that one. So we asked the question, what happened if we implemented, those risk calculator in the community? Do we reduce the risk of fracture? Do we increase BMD? The answer seems to be yes. Now, if you look at the average bone density in the initial cohort, it was about 0.78, probably doesn't mean anything, but 10 years later, the average bone density was about 0.84, the same age, right? So an increase of about 7% of bone density. When I look at this number, I say, wow, it doesn't work. Only 7% increase in BMD. Look like our calculator is in a mess now. We run into a problem with NHMRC. And so, we look at hang on, this is a BMD. It's not a hard outcome. What we want is the hard outcome, which is a fracture. Wow, that's where, we hit the spot. In the initial cohort, we found that the risk of hip fracture was about 8.5 per 1,000 person years. And imagine that, 10 years later, it reduced into 3.3. So a 45% reduction in hip fracture. This is what we want. This is what we want. So a very modest increase in BMD, but could translate into a huge reduction in the incidence of hip fracture. So we already written up, this paper, and we're going to publish this very soon, and hopefully, we'll create a little bit of the media. So you know your number. So now the next question is, what about the managing of your risk? Well, we already know the risk factor. We already know the culprits. We know that get physically active is one thing you should do. You can get your number from our bone checks. Do not smoke and do not drink too much. I have to make a little bit notes here. We just found out that for people with a moderate drinking, they seem to have a better bone health. We didn't want to tell the public about that, because it looked like they have a lower risk of fracture and they have a higher BMD if you drink it moderately. But excessive alcohol is really bad for bone, right? And get enough calcium and vitamin D. And all of these are very simple measures that you can take it at your convenient time, and so you can reduce your fracture. Now, I just found out another thing about the Rose paradox. We call it the Rose prevention paradox. He said, Jeffrey Rose, he said that, and I'm talking about 30 years ago, he predicted that measures or an intervention that brings little benefit to an individual can have a major impact on the population. How does it work? I mean, if you look at it again, my data earlier, the increase in BMD was only 7%. minimal, but it reduced the incidence of fracture by 45%. So I thought, well, maybe, it's very consistent, with this, prediction, with this axiom. It's a prevention paradox. And the more I think about that, I think that's probably true. Little things can matter. Think about seatbelt. Think about COVID-19 vaccination. Seatbelt, we all, wearing a seatbelt when we drive a car. And you know that, wearing a seatbelt brings little benefit to us individually anyway. Why? Because the probability of having a car accident is very low. Most of us, in our entire lifetime, we do not have car accident anyway, but we still wear a seatbelt. And yet, wearing a seatbelt, brings a huge benefit to the community and the population. The same with, vaccination. I got 3 doses of vaccination during the COVID-19, but I never got, COVID-19. I never got COVID-19. So the benefit of vaccination to an individual is a very little, if you like, negligible. However, we know that vaccination works, and it did work. It saved a lot of people, it saved lives. So it comes back, to the raw answer again, that the little things, the intervention that bring little benefit to an individual can have a major impact on the population. So we have to distinguish between personal level and a population level. So little thing that we as an individual can do can make a huge difference to the general population. So that brings me to the statement that protecting your bones by taking enough calcium, vitamin D, by stop smoking, by getting yourself physically active and things like that, you can make a major contribution to the community. What do I mean by a major contribution? Because we can reduce the risk of hip fracture, and if you reduce the risk of hip fracture in the community, you also saving lives, a lot of people. So let me come back to my key message. Know your numbers. How do you know your number? You can go to our bone check application. It's now a trademark with the Department of IP now. And once you know your number, you can manage your risk. You can push back your risk. And as a result, you can protect your bones and have a healthy life and healthy aging. People like me, the word healthy aging is very important. And hopefully in the future, we will eliminate this sort of figures. This is a photo of a lady who got osteoporosis. You can see she got a hunchback. There's osteoporosis in Cambodia. I took the photo. I hope that in the future we will not see this sort of photo in the world anymore. Okay, so before I finish, let me have a few words of thank you. I thank my lab members who have been working very hard to gather the data so that I can share with you. My colleagues at the Garvan Institute of Medical Research, Professor John Eisman, who was my mentor. He was a very difficult mentor, but I learned a lot from him. My colleagues, Jackie Center and Diana Bullitt, who used to be my student, they all contributed to the double autoprocess study. Without them, we couldn't do the study for 30 years. Apart from that, my colleagues in Vietnam, where we start the Vietnam autoprocess study, we also recruit about 4,000 people, and so far we have followed them for about 8 years. That's also contributed a lot of data so that we created the bone check algorithm. And finally, I have to thank Professor Chia for her kind invitation, and Jinx out there, and for those guys and girls who organized this event. And I hope you have enjoyed the show about the fractures and how to prevent fractures, and so that we can have a healthy life in the future. Thank you very much.
We know that formula, right?
Yes.
We know the formulas about our risk. We know how to protect ourselves. And we know we need the number, right? So now it's a question time. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
Yes, John.
Eugene. So that 7% increase in bone density over that 10-year
10
period,
years, yes.
do we know what the biggest factor that has contributed to that is? Is it exercise? Is it diet? Is it,
Yes,
you know,
yeah,
is it
that-
knowledge about,
Yeah.
you know, fracture risk?
Yeah, that is a very important question. Yeah, we did look at the data. I think the the prevalence of smoking reduced very significantly. And when we measure the physical activity, we measure by MET, we call it metabolic expenditure index. And they also increased very significantly over the years. So I think, this is my biased view. I think because since we run the study and we introduce, these calculators to the community, and they start realizing the seriousness of fractures, and they got more information for prevention. So that's why the younger generation, they take more preventive measures to reduce the risk. Yeah. So, I mean, I wouldn't claim that, because of this calculator, so that, they're getting better. But I guess, we also can make that claim because with the calculator, so that, they will take preventive measures. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions?
I had another one.
Yeah, please.
Those 200 genes that you've got to snip in
Yes.
that are associated with bone fracture. Again, do you understand the kind of intricacies of what risk,
Yes.
which factors affect the expression of those? I'm not sure if it's expression.
Well, that's
or
another.
which are most important, so that that 200 genes is a lot.
A lot, yes. That's another expensive question. Out of those, now, some people they claim there's 300 genetic variants now. Out of those 200 genes that we discovered initially, only one gene that we knew the mechanism, that is the LRP5 genes. The rest, they was in a non-coding region, meaning that, non-coding region, we have no idea, how they have effects on bone mass. Only one gene, that is LRP5. We know that LRP5 have a biological effect on bone metabolism because it's worked through the bone formation and the rancoligand pathway. But the rest, we have no idea. And a lot of people, they try to do a basic experiment, to find out what's the case. Didn't come out with anything. So this is something, we keep arguing all the time. So some people say, well, if you don't know the mechanism of this gene and bone density, so why should you use it in bone check anyway? My argument, my answer is that, yes, that's a very good question, but, we have to come from a realistic scenario. You don't need to know exactly how things work, but as long as you know that, this thing can allow you to predict or to identify people with high risk of fracture. And when you intervene on these people, you can reduce the risk of outcome. I think that from a public health point of view is good enough. Smoking, come on, smoking and bone density, we also not sure. How does it work? Well, we know a little bit about bone metabolism and so on, but precise mechanism, we don't know. But we know that people, when they stop smoking, their bone health become better. And I think, from that point of view, I think it's good enough to use it, to go out to the public, say, you should stop smoking. So that's my argument. I know that a lot of people, hardcore biologists, they do not agree with me because from a biological point of view, they have to know the mechanism, the exact mechanism, in order to make a causal inference. Yeah.
Excellent. Any other questions? Oh, many.
Just a quick question, very simple question regarding the female bones hip fracture.
Yes.
Do you think any subgroup of the female, for example, pregnant and non-pregnant, pregnant? Because I'm mom, I feel I lost a lot of calcium after the pregnant.
Yeah.
That's I'm thinking, do I have a high chance to have the hip fracture when I'm getting old?
Yes, yes. Hip fractures, it is the most serious consequence of osteoporosis because it increases the risk of death. I mean, mortality, death is one of the things that we should worry about, right? And we spend a lot of time looking for people which we're looking for a subgroup of hip fractures so that we can prevent it. And so far we found no one. We only found that those are people with a low bone density. That is the most important risk factor. And once we give the medications to increase the bone density, we have evidence that if we give the medication, we reduce the risk of fracture, but more importantly, we also prolong their life expectancy. So if I give them, zoledronic acid, instead, if they have a hip fracture, they probably die, within, say, 12 months. But if with zoledronic acid, they can live for another 5 years. So with that, I think bone density is the major risk factor. So that's why I think for those people who are 65 years and older, they should go for a bone density check. In Australia, bone density check for those group of people is reimbursed by the government anyway, so you don't have to spend any money on that. Yeah. Or you can go, or you can go to bone checks, and if your risk is high, and the doctor may initiate a treatment, and that's also reimbursed by the government. So the bone check algorithm already accepted by the Royal Australian College of Physicians as a way to assess, the risk of fracture and prevention. Yeah.
Okay. Next.
David.
Hi, you mentioned that everybody has a specific gene signature. So you did the Australian double study, and now you've progressed to the Vietnamese study.
Yes.
So in your opinion, are there any fundamental differences between the two ethnic groups?
Well, some time ago, last year, the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism asked me to write an editorial on the polygenic risk score. And they asked me, what does it mean? It just simply means a number. I explained in that editorial that a polygenic risk score is not just a genetic signature, which is a rhetoric way of saying about gene. Anyway. To me, a PRS or polygenic risk score is a way to quantify the genetic liability for an individual. Now, we know that Asian population have a different genetic makeup from Caucasian population. But unfortunately, 95% of genome-wide association study around the world was based on Caucasian population, not Asian population. Only in recent years, in China and Korea and Japan, they start doing a very big scale, large scale study on genome-wide association study. And based on those studies, we know that. And something, it's not really surprising that, the genetic makeup between Asian and Caucasians are different. So what it means is that I think in the future, there are several genetics signatures, several polygenic risk scores for different ethnicity. So Asian population, they have a different genetic risk score compared with Caucasian. And who knows, even the South American and Africa, they also have a different polygenic risk score. And that's why the Broad Institute in Massachusetts, they are now working very hard to attract more participants around the world so that they can create a diversity. They have diversified the genetics information for the entire world. And we are working with them to contribute more data. Yeah. But the problem is, they don't give us money, so they want information.
Any questions? Yes.
So mine might be a technical question. Thank you for your presentation, and also think more broadly for your work in this area, which is really significant. I guess my question is to do with, given the significance of hip fractures and other fractures with mortality, as you sort of laid out for us, and given the nature of preventability around this, and given the social and economic consequences of this as a society, why isn't there more awareness of this problem in broader society? And also, why isn't there better public health responses in relation to this?
Well, that's a very good question. When we started the double study in early 1990, people even didn't think that men have a fracture. They think we are strong or something, they didn't think. If you look at those studies at the time, they did not include men. They did not include men. But in our own study, we say, hey, that's something wrong, because men do have fracture, and once they have fracture, they're more likely to die than women. That's another thing. So, and we don't know why. I think maybe because in the old days, back in the 1960 or 1950, if you go through the medical textbooks, they talk about the connection between estrogens and bone mass and fractures. And estrogen is the woman hormone. Men also have estrogen, by the way, but a minimal amount. And I think that is the reason why, until 1990s, when we talk about osteoporosis, they say, that's a woman disease. It's not a man disease. So it took us quite some time to raise the awareness of the issues of hip fractures and the consequent, the social and the clinical consequences of it. So in 1994, I remember correctly, 1994, we published a first paper showing that men and women have fracture, they have reduced life expectancy. We published in the Lancet. I think at the moment, I think the paper may attract more than 2,000 citations. And since then, but when the paper first came out, I should also, when the paper first came out, nobody cited, because they probably didn't believe us. They think we are from overseas, Australia. This guy crazy or something. No, I don't mean that. And after 5 years, and then we go out to talk about it, and then they say, look, man, maybe these Australian guys, they have a point to say. And they start to look at the paper, and a lot of validation study after that, they found exactly the same thing. And then our paper citations start, speed up. So now we got more than 2,000 citations. But even so, when I go to talk to the doctors in those CME course, they even didn't realize that 20% of hip fracture dies within a year. They don't realize it. But the surgeons, the orthopedic surgeons, they do know that. And as a result, a GP, they don't realize the seriousness of osteoporosis. So they don't prescribe medication to these people. So if they have a fracture, okay, I introduce, I refer to an orthopedic surgeon, they fix the bone, and then they're done. So we have a crisis of management at the moment. That crisis means that 80% of people with a hip fracture do not receive any treatment. 80%, 80. And you know that, these people, if they do not receive any treatment, they're going to die. Imagine that you have a stroke and you are not under treatment. And that's exactly what happened to hip fracture. So when we try to sell, when we try to promote, our bone checks, I always start off with the crisis of management. I said, why don't you treat these people? They have a high risk here, and here's a bone check, it's recognized by, everyone in the medical community. And they start saying, but maybe because bisphosphonates is associated with other things like osteonecrosis of the jaws and, long bone. But I say, hang on, 1 million people take bisphosphonates, only one case like that. But so you have to balance between the risk and the benefit. The benefit is that you can prevent 50% of fractures. And then, more important, you save lives. Save lives. That's more important. And until now, things pick up a little bit. So it's not 80% anymore, but still about 60% are not on any treatment. So, I mean, I don't know, we are human, it takes some time for us to change our perception, right? You know more than me about that, psychological, you think?
Yeah, any more questions? Okay, if not, please join me to thank distinguished Professor Nguyen AM for his wonderful talk today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.